The year is 1775, and social ills plague both France and England. Jerry Cruncher, an odd-job man who works for Tellson's Bank, stops the Dover mail coach with an urgent message for Jarvis Lorry. The message instructs Lorry to wait at Dover for a young woman, and Lorry responds with the cryptic words, "recalled to life." At Dover, Lorry is met by Lucy Manette, a young orphan whose father, a once eminent doctor whom she supposed dead, has been discovered in France. Lorry escorts Lucy to Paris, where they meet Defarge, a former servant of Dr. Manette, who has kept Manette safe in a garret. Driven mad by 18 years in the Bastille, Manette spends all of his time making shoes, a hobby he learned while in prison. Lorry assures Lucy that her love and devotion can recall her father to life, and indeed they do. The year is now 1780. Charles Darnay stands accused of treason against the English crown. A bombastic lawyer named Stryver pleads Darnay's case, but it is not until his drunk, good-for-nothing colleague, Sidney Carton, assists him that the court acquits Darnay. Carton clinches his argument by pointing out that he himself bears an uncanny resemblance to the defendant, which undermines the prosecution's case for unmistakably identifying Darnay as the spy the authorities spotted. Lucy and Dr. Manette watch the court proceedings, and that night, Carton escorts Darnay to a tavern and asks how it feels to receive the sympathy of a woman like Lucy. Carton despises and resents Darnay because he reminds him of all that he himself has given up and might have been. In France, the cruel Marquis Evrémonde runs down a plebeian child with his carriage. Manifesting an attitude typical of the aristocracy in regard to the poor at that time, the Marquis shows no regret, but instead curses the peasantry and hurries home to his chateau, where he awaits the arrival of his nephew, Darnay, from England. Arriving later that night, Darnay curses his uncle and the French aristocracy for its abominable treatment of the people. He renounces his identity as an Evrémonde and announces his intention to return to England. That night, the Marquis is murdered. The murderer has left a note signed with the nickname adopted by French revolutionaries, Jacques. A year passes, and Darnay asks Manette for permission to marry Lucy. He says that, if Lucy accepts, he will reveal his true identity to Manette. Carton, meanwhile, also pledges his love to Lucy, admitting that, though his life is worthless, she has helped him dream of a better, more valuable existence. On the streets of London, Jerry Cruncher gets swept up in the funeral procession for a spy named Roger Cly. Later that night, he demonstrates his talents as a resurrection man, sneaking into the cemetery to steal and sell Cly's body. In Paris, meanwhile, another English spy known as John Barsad drops into Defarge's wine shop. Barsad hopes to turn up evidence concerning the mounting revolution, which is still in its covert stages. Madame Defarge sits in the shop knitting a secret registry of those whom the revolution seeks to execute. Back in London, Darnay, on the morning of his wedding, keeps his promise to Manette. He reveals his true identity and, that night, Manette relapses into his old prison habit of making shoes. After 9 days, Manette regains his presence of mind, and soon joins the newlyweds on their honeymoon. Upon Darnay's return, Carton pays him a visit and asks for his friendship. Darnay assures Carton that he is always welcome in their home. The year is now 1789. The peasants in Paris storm the Bastille, and the French Revolution begins. The revolutionaries murder aristocrats in the streets, and Gabelle, a man charged with the maintenance of the Evrémonde estate, is imprisoned. 3 years later, he writes to Darnay asking to be rescued. Despite the threat of great danger to his person, Darnay departs immediately for France. As soon as Darnay arrives in Paris, the French revolutionaries arrest him as an emigrant. Lucy and Manette make their way to Paris in hopes of saving him. Darnay remains in prison for a year and 3 months before receiving a trial. In order to help free him, Manette uses his considerable influence with the revolutionaries, who sympathize with him for having served time in the Bastille. Darnay receives an acquittal, but that same night he is arrested again. The charges, this time, come from Defarge and his vengeful wife. Carton arrives in Paris with a plan to rescue Darnay, and obtains the help of John Barsad, who turns out to be Solomon Pross, the long-lost brother of Miss Pross, Lucy's loyal servant. At Darnay's trial, Defarge produces a letter that he discovered in Manette's old jail cell in the Bastille. The letter explains the cause of Manette's imprisonment. Years ago, the brothers Evremond enlisted Manette's medical assistance. They asked him to tend to a woman, whom one of the brothers had raped, and her brother, whom the same brother had stabbed fatally. Fearing that Manette might report their misdeeds, the Evremonds had him arrested. Upon hearing this story, the jury condemns Darnay for the crimes of his ancestors and sentences him to die within 24 hours. That night, at the Defarges' wine shop, Carton overhears Madame Defarge plotting to have Lucy and her daughter executed as well. Madame Defarge, it turns out, is the surviving sibling of the man and woman killed by the Evremonds. Carton arranges for the Manettes' immediate departure from France. He then visits Darnay in prison, tricks him into changing clothes with him, and, after dictating a letter of explanation, drugs his friend unconscious. Barsad carries Darnay, now disguised as Carton, to an awaiting coach, while Carton, disguised as Darnay, awaits execution. As Darnay, Lucy, their child, and Dr. Manette speed away from Paris, Madame Defarge arrives at Lucy's apartment, hoping to arrest her. There she finds the supremely protective Miss Pross. A scuffle ensues, and Madame Defarge dies by the bullet of her own gun. Sidney Carton meets his death at the guillotine, and the narrator confidently asserts that Carton dies with the knowledge that he has finally imbued his life with meaning. A Tale of Two Cities is structured around a central conflict between Charles Darnay's desire to break free of his family legacy and Madame Defarge's desire to hold him accountable for the violent actions of his father and uncle. This conflict embodies conflicting aspects of the French Revolution in general. On one hand, the revolution led to the deaths of many people who hadn't done anything wrong, and were likely good people on a personal level. On the other hand, the revolution was a response to generations of well-documented injustices. Like Darnay, many French aristocrats could be considered guilty by association, or as a result of profiting from systems of exploitation. The plot is set in motion years before the action of the novel begins, when the Evremond brothers participate in a series of violent and cruel actions toward members of Madame Defarge's family, and then unjustly imprison young Dr. Manette in order to conceal their crimes. Readers don't find out about these incidents until late in the novel, but the fact that they have been propelling the plot mirrors how history unfolds. The violence of the revolution doesn't just come out of nowhere. It breaks out because of the accumulation of decades of unjust treatment and abuses of power. Similarly, crimes committed generations earlier continue to haunt and threaten Darnay, Lucy, and Dr. Manette. Key events like Darnay building a career for himself in England, getting married, and starting his own family seem to be taking him closer to his desire of living a good and honest life without exploiting or hurting anyone. However, as Darnay eventually realizes, he hasn't actually resolved the conflict because he has never taken responsibility for the suffering his family has caused. He has only run away from it. As Darnay admits, he knew very well that in his love for Lucy, his renunciation of his social place had been hurried and incomplete. In order to fully obtain his desire and break all bonds with a system he despises, Darnay returns to France. Darnay's return moves the action quickly toward its climax. When Darnay gets arrested, freed, and then arrested a second time, the conflict intensifies between Darnay's freedom and Madame Defarge's desire to see him and all of his family punished. The novel resolves this conflict with twin climaxes. Sidney Carton smuggles Darnay out of prison and takes his place on the execution block, while Madame Defarge becomes a victim of her own desire for violence after she is killed while struggling with Miss Pross. These climaxes allow Darnay to achieve his goal of being fully liberated from his family burden. After another man dies for his sins, he goes on to live a happy and peaceful life. The following action is largely revealed in Carton's hypothetical final vision, showing the Manette Darnay family living happily together, and faithfully remembering the man who gave up his life for them.